If you're thinking about leaving the United States, possibly for good, you should understand that it may not always be cheap and that planning ahead and taking action earlier rather than later is generally better. Today, I'm going to walk you through all the costs of leaving the United States. I wanted to talk about this again because I keep seeing people having misconceptions, and I found an article on Forbes of all places, written by an attorney of all people, who actually got the numbers wrong. The numbers he's using are quite outdated, and so I think a lot of people are getting confused, and so I wanted to cover, if you want to leave the United States, at 3 different levels, what that looks like, and I'm going to set the record straight for 2022. If it's your first time here, I'm Andrew Henderson, founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best. Everything from dramatically reducing your taxes, yes, even as an American, diversifying and protecting your assets no matter where you're from, having a second citizenship so that no one country can control you. We cover it all at nomadcapitalist.com. So let's talk about what it costs to leave the US. First things first, the actual physical cost of getting out. It's a plane ticket, right? Certainly as an American, if you have a US passport, you can travel around the world as a perpetual tourist. If you're single, that works better than I suppose if you have multiple kids, but I know people who have 4 kids who do it. And that's not going to be a long-term lifestyle, but you can go to countries like Georgia, for example, and stay for a year. Albania is the same. You can go, 90 days to Europe and then go next door. I mean, you can, as an American, as a U.S. passport holder, and as most Western passport holders, you can travel to certain places for quite an amount of time. That is changing. Mexico, for example, 180 days. They're asking a lot more questions, and they really don't want you staying there for 6 months. They want you to get a residence permit. Countries like the UK, 180 days. If you tell them you're spending on 180 days, they're going to wonder what you're doing. But you can start by just simply buying a plane ticket and booking hotels. And with the cost of housing these days in the US, I'll bet even a hotel or an Airbnb in some of these places it can't cost more in parts of Eastern Europe, parts of Latin America, parts of wherever else. And so whether you're a 7- or 8-figure entrepreneur or not, the cost of getting out is a plane ticket. Now, what I would suggest is having some kind of residence permit so you at least have a base. Latin American countries we've talked about in other episodes, generally you show an income. Most Americans are going to qualify for that if their goal is to move. Digital nomad visas you can get, some of them are as little as $700 a month, right? In Colombia, for example, rolling out one, okay? And so if you're going to move, you want to find a way to make sure that your tax strategy is in place, but we'll get to that. The actual cost of leaving is simply buying a plane ticket. And so I think people make it out to be some big thing. Yes, I recommend that the more successful you are, you have residence permits. You probably want to have your Plan B citizenship in place. You want to have maybe a passport portfolio in place. You want to have some banking overseas. You want to have everything. But understand that where you are going to ultimately go and live may not be where your banking is, may not be where your citizenship's from. You want to be diversified. And so the actual physical process of moving is not necessarily tied to the stuff that you're going to do, because a lot of people set up their plan B first. They get their bank accounts, they get their diversification, they move some assets into a trust, they buy a property overseas, they get a residence permit just to keep in their back pocket, they get a citizenship just in case the US goes wild, and then they'll move somewhere separate, right? And so the actual cost of getting out isn't that bad. Now, let's talk about the cost of being a US citizen overseas, because one of the misconceptions I constantly see is you can't save taxes as an American overseas because we have citizenship-based taxation in the United States, and that's true. You do have, for people who have active incomes, the foreign earned income exclusion, and that number went up to $112,000 in 2022. There's a few ways to just bump it up a little bit, but let's call it 112 as kind of the basic number. And so if you and your spouse are married, you can both claim 112. So if you have a job, that could work. Now, depending on where the employer is, you may have Social Security and other obligations. If you can employ yourself, and the US does make it more difficult in terms of you can't just generally start a one-man company. So if you're just a one-person consultant, one-woman consultant, you can't generally just start. There's more restrictions on starting that on an offshore company. But if you have an offshore company, if you've got a legitimate business, you can use the foreign earned income exclusion, you can retain earnings, and you can basically not pay really very much at all, even on more than the 112. Now, what happens is if you're running a business and you're making substantially more than 112, depending on the ownership structure, depending on how it's set up, there may be some tax requirements to the United States, but those are dramatically less than what it would be living in the United States. The bigger issue for some folks, especially those that have lower incomes, is the reporting requirements. So if you've got a foreign corporation, you've got to file a form for that. If you have foreign bank accounts, it's not that difficult. I suggest everybody do it. Have a CPA. We work with some of these folks. for our services. Have international CPAs and tax attorneys who know how to file an FBAR. It's really not that hard. I see a lot of people making that mistake and not filing them, but have that done. Follow everything legally, but you're gonna have paperwork to fill out, right? And so I think it's often easier for Americans is to go to a place that's tax neutral or tax free, because then you're not compounding where two tax systems are fighting with each other. So either you go to a place with a treaty where that works out beautifully, or you go to a tax free or a territorial tax or a tax exempt or a non-dom place where even non-dom would be more difficult. But you don't want the tax systems fighting with each other. One of the concerns people in Canada have is, hey, we're paying Canadian taxes. We're not getting off lightly up here. But yet we still have to deal with other stuff in the US because the tax systems don't always line up perfectly. So moving to a place like a Canada is not really that advantageous, because you can have kind of taxes on top of taxes. Even in the case where there's a treaty, it can be difficult. And so that's why I think for Americans, going to places where it's just a flat, easy deal on tax, whether it's 0, 5, whatever it is percent, is often better. So there's discounted taxes you may have to pay or may not, but you have to keep that in mind. It's not going to be full boat for most people, especially for entrepreneurs. Reporting requirements are going to be there, and no doubt there are going to be some hassles. That's the cost of being an American overseas, but I would rather have the hassles, as they're talking about hiring all these new IRS agents in the US. There are some people who are saying, you're going to get audited, it's only a matter of if, it's only a matter of when, not if. And so, listen, I would rather be paying 8% than paying 40%. Sitting in the US, and I can have my choice of dozens of places around the world to live. Maybe I can live in a place that works towards a second citizenship. Maybe I have a better lifestyle. Maybe I have a lower cost of living to beat inflation, put more money back into my business. So the cost of being a US citizen overseas running a business is going to be discounted taxes, reporting, and some hassles. It's all doable, and you can still save a bunch of money. Obviously, the more money you make, the better the ROI is. The cost of getting out of that, the hassles, and the reporting requirements and any tax liability at all, is expatriating. And this is where I think that the Forbes article that I came across really missed the mark, I'm sad to say. And that is, how does the expatriation process work? If you have, forget the legal process, we've talked about that before, of dealing with the State Department. From a tax perspective, depending on when you expatriate, you will need to file a final tax return, and you will need to file an expatriation tax return. If you have either not been in tax compliance, or you've got a net worth of $2 million or more, which is everything put together, or you have income of $178,000 on year, $178,000 of federal tax liability on your income, on average, over the last 5 years. So about $890,000 over the last 5 years. If that's your federal income tax liability, any of those three things could trigger it. So if you're not in tax compliance, talk to someone and get in tax compliance. So that's should be easy enough. If you have more than $2 million, well, that's going to be a problem. And if you have a bunch of income, that could be a problem. There's ways to get around that potentially by delaying things. Obviously, I'm not giving you tax advice. This is the kind of thing that we work with people on with our attorneys and accountants and all of the professionals that we have. And you can work with us at nomadcapitalist.com. But the point is, if you have a business, we had a guy once, he came and said, my business is worth $100 million. Should I renounce? Like, you should have called me when the business was a lot smaller, because he wasn't really able to sell any of the business to get the liquidity freed up to pay the exit tax. Okay? How does the exit tax work? When you leave the United States, when you expatriate from the United States, you will be subject to an exit tax if you meet one of those three criteria. So the $2 million net worth, the federal income tax liability, or you're not in compliance. Okay? The hardest one of those really to deal with is the net worth, because unless you're like investing in Bitcoin and you have 5 million and now you have 1.8 million, then is your company going down in value? You want to move faster. So once you trigger the covered expatriate status, they call it, you're going to have this exit tax requirement. In 2022, you get the first $767,000 in gains for free. So if you meet any of the requirements and you have $767,000 in gains or less, you don't pay anything. Okay? So theoretically, you have a $3 million net worth, but you bought stocks for $2.5 million, and that's everything you have. You have $500,000 net worth. The $767 covers it, and you're cool. The other situation could be, you have a $100 million net worth, but you bought into crypto for $200 million, and so now you have like a capital loss on the books, and so you don't have any unrealized capital gains. That's what they're looking to tax on the way out. Other countries do that, by the way, and so whether you're an American or not, if you're leaving Canada, for example, right, you don't have to give up your citizenship, but you're going to go through a similar process of becoming tax non-resident. So it's much less emotional and much less irreversible. But you're still basically going through the process of, hey, oh, you're not going to live here anymore? Well, that's great. Well, why don't you pay us? Now, some countries allow you to leave them certain security, which I don't know. A lot of people don't want to do that. Like if you have stocks, okay, here, I'll leave some stocks as security. But if you have a business, how do you handle that, right? So no matter where you're from, if your country's an exit tax, either an expatriation, renunciation of citizenship, or just taxed on residence, you want to get out sooner than later, because the guy who has the $100 million business that he started with zero, right? Especially if it's like, oh, our last financing round was X and it's value of $100 million. You can't really argue with that, right? And so you're going to pay on all your unrealized capital gains, whatever the capital gains tax rate is. And so, it could be $100 million, $23, $24 million. Obviously you get the $767,000 for free, but you're going to still pay, $23 million in tax. And so that's the biggest cost, right? Now, some folks who have investments who are Americans will choose to go into Puerto Rico. And so in a business, you can basically stretch it out to where the business was 5 years in the US, it's 5 years in Puerto Rico. You can be able to save some money there, more based on the time, less based on the value, right? And so that could work for entrepreneurs if you want to live in Puerto Rico. And then that could be paired in the future with other strategies. If you don't live in Puerto Rico and you just want to be able to go wherever you want to go, then that's obviously going to be more difficult. And so the point is, you don't want to wait for things to take off. And for example, in the cryptocurrency run-up of 2021, our phone was ringing off the hook. And really, it should have been ringing off the hook in 2018 and 2019. We had some folks then, but it should have been ringing off the hook then when people were bummed out after 2017 and they were feeling like they were in this crypto bear market. They should have been preparing, because then all those gains that they were making as every single day went by would have been outside of the tax system, but they didn't. And so the cost to get out of the US isn't really that high to just travel and go and live somewhere else if you don't care about taxes. If you just say, I want more freedom, I don't like what the government's doing, I don't like the cost of living, I just don't feel like I don't identify with the country. I didn't have nearly as much money when I decided to leave the US. I'm just like, I don't really like it here. I just want to live somewhere else, right? And I figured out, how does the taxes work, right? So if that's you, that's relatively affordable. If you just want to live overseas and save taxes, okay, you can do that. Again, if you have a business, try and build up into a real business rather than just doing something on your own. That's probably going to make your life easier in most cases. And then you can save dramatic amounts of taxes. If you just want to be done with the place entirely and not have some of the ongoing filing requirements, which again, if you have someone helping you, I don't want it to be like that bad. I think people overblow it sometimes. But if you just want to be totally out of it, for whatever reason, again, you just don't feel like you belong there and it's just not worth it, you don't want the hassles, you don't want to pay anything, that's where the cost comes in. So I think what you want to do is, people aren't going to get to that last step, instantly in most cases. When I looked at a report recently, I said most people who renounced citizenship had been living overseas for a number of years and just kind of lost the connection to the US, didn't really feel like they needed it anymore. For me, I wanted to live outside of the United States. And I worked towards the part of, okay, now I'm comfortable taking this next step. I didn't just renounce on day one. You want to get your feet wet. But the challenge there is, if you're building some kind of business overseas, there's going to be a price to pay when you eventually leave. And so you want to have someone helping you to plan this all along the way, to where you don't basically say, oh, I'd like to renounce my citizenship, even if it's not for financial reasons, but because I now have a $100 million company, I'm not able to. How do I get $23 million freed up, right? And so those are the costs to be aware of. Again, if you don't have capital gains, then you don't really have an issue. And so if you're down for the count right now because of some investment and it went down, that's the time to move, not just to expatriate, but just to leave your country. That's when you want to do it. All right? But it's always a good time, I think, to get out, see the world, diversify, reduce your tax burden, and then see where you go next. Just be aware of that ultimate cost to get out.